Hi, everybody. Welcome to all who are joining us. We'll get started in just a moment, but as you log on, please share your name and where you're joining us from. And sorry, I meant share it in the chat. Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining us today, whether it is morning, afternoon, or evening where you are. We're so glad to have you joining us for the second part of our two-part webinar focused on COP27 and this critical moment of climate action. For those of you who weren't able to make last week's webinar, we gave an overview of what the COP is and how our United Methodist agencies are engaged. And we have a link to that webinar. If you missed it and you'd like to check it out, that's in the chat. So please do. And for now, for today's webinar, I want to introduce you to our panelists. My name is Reverend Jenny Phillips. I'm Senior Technical Advisor for Environmental Sustainability at Global Ministries. We also have Jake Barnett, Director of Sustainable Investment Services at Westpath, Ilka Vega, Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice with United Women in Faith, and John Hill, Deputy General Secretary with Church and Society. Last week, John, Jake, and I were joining the webinar from Egypt, and Ilka was not in Egypt yet, and we passed the baton to her over the weekend. She is now at the COP in Egypt, and John and I are back in the US. Jake's at another meeting in Germany, but it's been neat to transition between our teams to work at and cover this event. So in case you weren't at that last webinar, COP27 is the annual climate summit. And it's currently in its second and final week at Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. John, can you tell us a little bit more about what this conference is?
Sure. And folks, there's a sort of broader overview of COP27 in the earlier webinar, but for folks who weren't on that one, basically the COP, that acronym means the Conference of the Parties, and those are the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that was the agreement back in 1994 by countries around the world, really all countries to tackle the climate crisis, both reducing emissions, so the mitigation side, the causes of climate change, and the realities of climate change. How do we provide assistance for countries that are impacted, including adaptation and climate finance, to really build a cleaner energy future? So every year, those parties to that framework convention gather to figure out how to move that agenda forward, how we increase progress. We get new scientific assessments that really detail the need for action, hear from folks who are deeply impacted by the current climate crisis, and then hopefully catalyze additional ambition and action globally for that conference. There's a couple pieces. There's the formal negotiations that happen, and then a lot of civil society present to try and really energize and infuse lived experience into those conversations. So that's the overall conversation that's happening in Sharm el-Sheikh right now. Ilka, you were on the ground. I'm kind of curious. We were there the first week, had some sense of where the negotiations were heading. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but just kind of curious from your perspective on the ground now, what's the what's the sense? Do we feel like there might be some success in Sharm el Sheikh this year?
Yeah, I think that the feelings are mixed at the moment. We start to see the nights getting longer and longer here. It's past 8 p.m. in Egypt, and there's still a lot of folks. You might hear it on the background noise behind me and the people walking by, but there's still a lot of activity, and the nights are getting longer. Negotiators are going up to 14 hours a day right now, working really hard. Today we had the People's Plenary, and we got to hear from indigenous voices and frontline communities, specific island communities, hearing about the loss and damage there and the desperation I think that they have, and really frustration about wanting more from this COP. We had a Pacific Island negotiator with us this morning talk with us about some of that process and how difficult it has been for them. And they said that they cannot leave the COP without getting some language on loss and damage. And she just said it with a format of like, this is all we have. Like, we have to do it now. We have momentum and we have to do it. So within that, I hear a little bit of hope, but definitely we see a lot of concerns from people really wanting to make sure that we do the best we can. We hear it from civil society agencies kind of galvanizing and being very strategic about who the fossil of the day is going to, and how they're going to try to push their own negotiators from their respective countries to do more for loss and damage, and particularly we're in the cover language as well, where we've seen some of the biggest gaps so far.
That's super helpful. I think, we're now tracking it from afar, so we see kind of where the progress of the negotiating text is and what the different party positions are, but just to get a feel for the energy in the COP, which, it's a 2-week process. It's a marathon. The first week, for folks who haven't been to the COPs, the first week is really sort of setting the preliminary work, that work that folks can kind of reach consensus on. And then the second week kicks it up to the ministerial. So the higher level folks, the sort of heads of delegation, sometimes heads of state come in, and a lot of high level diplomacy on those areas of disagreement, hopefully to reach, and Ilka, you mentioned this, kind of a decision text, right? Ultimately, it's about having words on a paper that are agreed upon by all the parties. One of the things that's unique about the COP is that it is a consensus process, right? It's a party-driven process, and ultimately there isn't a vote, right? Everyone has to agree to it, and so while that might be frustratingly inefficient, it's also really helps challenge some of those international and global power structures, right? So that you have small island states in the spaces where they can really challenge historic emitters, wealthier countries, and demand progress, demand action, kind of what you were referencing, Ilka, in terms of just how they can't leave without something. And so if folks want to have a successful outcome, all parties have to be a part of it. I hope it doesn't go into overtime, but sometimes they do. They extend, beyond the regular rhythm of the conversation. What we're seeing, at least reporting, and I think this tracks with just what we had a sense of even from the first week, is that while Egypt, the host country, has billed this as an implementation COP, it's really turning into a finance COP. Like, will there be money made available? Will wealthier nations actually agree to additional financing, both long-term, right, a new quantitative goal on long-term climate finance, and specifically around loss and damage, whether there'll be a mechanism set up, a financial facility set up to address loss and damage. So yeah, Ilka, great. Just blessings to you. And if you need, we mapped out where all the free coffee is. So if you need any additional pointers, we can direct you there.
So loss and damage, that phrase keeps coming up. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit more deeply about what exactly it is, and also why this finance conversation is so important. Because, if you followed the news and these COPs in the news over the years, countries have committed lots and lots of money to address issues in the Paris Agreement. So what is loss and damage, John, and what's different about this conversation?
Yeah, so loss and damage, when we talk about loss and damage, that are climate impacts that cannot be avoided through mitigation, through adaptation, or even disaster risk management. So these might be losses, irreparable damages from extreme weather events like super typhoons, or it could be from slow onset events like sea level rise. When we talk about loss and damage, sometimes it's about an economic impact, sometimes it's non-economic, sometimes it's loss of culture, it's loss of sort of non-economic livelihoods. And so the conversation, I go back to a COP that was held in Warsaw, Poland. And at the time the COP was meeting, Super Typhoon Haiyan was bearing down on the Philippines. And one of the lead negotiators for the Philippines, Yeb Sanyo, took to the floor, and it was an incredibly emotional speech. And you can find it on YouTube. I highly recommend it. He basically dared those countries that denied the realities of climate change to get off their towers, out of their comfortable armchairs, and come to his hometown, Tacloban, which was being destroyed by Super Typhoon Haiyan. And it was at that COP, it really catalyzed sort of it brought the realities to these negotiations. And it was at that COP that they established something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. So while we've had sort of conversations and tracks around emissions reductions, around adaptation, there'd never been a separate conversation just on this loss and damage. So it was out of that Warsaw conversation that's still being worked on, the WIM, as they call it, Warsaw International Mechanism. But what we're finding is, while there are commitments on finance for climate finance, for both adaptation and clean energy work, global commitment around $100 billion, there has not been a willingness to sort of agree to financing for loss and damages. And that's been, the US has been a key, along with others, but US has been really key on being reluctant to agree to anything akin to financing for loss and damage. And so that's where the negotiations tend to be stuck. We were really happy at the beginning of this COP that there was an actual agenda item specifically on loss and damage finance. And that's where we're hopeful that somewhere over the next 48 hours, we can have some agreement to put together a finance facility for loss and damage.
It's so important because right now that gap is being filled mostly by humanitarian organizations. Like, when I hear you talk about loss and damage, I think of UMCOR and the disaster response work around the world, which is only one sliver of the scope of loss and damage as you described it, but it just illuminates the need for a much broader response. Ilka, you mentioned that you're hearing a lot on the ground about the importance of it, and I'm curious to know what activists are saying and if there are any questions or hesitation about the idea of this funding mechanism.
I don't think there's any hesitation from activists. We want something, and I think that's, at least there's alignment on what it would be. I think there's some conversations that still need to happen. This morning, I had the opportunity to listen to activists and artists. Aisha Sadika, she's from Pakistan, and she was sharing with us some of what Pakistans have been dealing with the flooding, and she was sharing some of the displacement that has occurred in the country, and also how many women that were pregnant were forced to give birth in the same places, in the same flooded waters where they buried their dead, and just how impactful that is, and really, it really, I think, brings a mental photo of what the urgency of us acting now is. And I think hearing from those voices is just extremely important. We had the ministry, the former president of Ireland there, and a lot of people on the audience just falling into tears, hearing those stories and hearing from the challenges that community is experiencing. But we know that it's not the only community alone, right? We have islands in the Pacific that just have completely disappeared in other parts of the world. So when we talk about loss and damage, it's loss and damage that is happening right now. And there has been huge distress, but unfortunately we have been backing up from facing some of the current loss and damage losses, and also some of the responsibilities that we have on that. I think there's been, in terms of their responses, we were also with the Department of State in an earlier meeting, and there had just been a lot of kind of finger pointing as to who should be putting the money for those responses, especially from the developed world, which is the most responsible for the climate emissions. Yet there's a lot of hesitation, unfortunately, still to contributing to a fund and putting even some language on it, right? Let alone what that would look like. We're hearing some people say, should we have multiple funds, or should we say we shouldn't have another extra fund that is not going to get funded, basically, or there's different conversations on it, but I think there's the main point that activists and especially G77, G20 and vulnerable climate vulnerable countries are really trying to push for is some sort of language for loss and damage. They're saying we can keep the conversation moving forward for the next couple or the next months on what that's exactly going to look like, but they don't want to leave the space without having at least that language included in the text.
Yeah. As I listen to you tell those stories, I feel so aware that we're talking about this as though it's apart from us. The UN conversation is somewhat apart from us, but this is a United Methodist conversation. It's a United Methodist issue because there are United Methodists around the world who are experiencing these climate impacts. And I'm aware many of our attendees today are based in the US. And so even in the US, we're experiencing climate impacts, but those in more climate vulnerable nations are experiencing them in deeper ways and in deeper need of resources. I am curious. The conversation around loss and damage is very government focused, and I'm thinking about where can money come from, and I wonder, Jake, from Westpath's perspective or from your perspective as a finance person, why do you think there isn't more effort to pursue financing, not just from governments, but also from historic corporate polluters to support loss and damage? And also, frankly, isn't there some opportunity, some investment opportunity and potential economic growth through loss and damage financing?
Yeah, I'll address kind of the question somewhat separately with the caveat that, these are really complex topics that also cut across legal, jurisdictional, policy questions that I don't claim to be an expert in. But when it comes to kind of where's the funding coming from and potential focus on corporate emitters as a source of revenue for loss and damage, one of the aspects that's important to keep in mind is that a lot of the enforcement mechanisms for what we're talking about are based on multilateral institutions that cut across multiple countries, in which there's not always as strong of an enforcement mechanism or as strong of an ability to kind of administer top-down policy as would be required to really extract revenue from different corporations in different jurisdictions. So there's not necessarily a mechanism for that individual in the Philippines to seek loss and damage from a corporate polluter who's headquartered in the US. With the current jurisdictional mechanisms that are available more broadly. Now, with that said, laws can change, mechanisms can change, governments can become more robust in what they're seeking to do in terms of how they're potentially pricing some of these things. And one of the key aspects of what I heard when I was at the COP sitting in on a conversation between high-level financiers and individuals from delegations and ministers of finance relating more to climate finance, but I think it's relevant for the loss and damage conversation, is that finance was ultimately saying, we will respond to what we consider the practical policies that are going to come forth to shape the financial system. An example of what that could look like that was given by the individual speaking was a carbon price. If there was a carbon price that came forth, you would see the finance markets respond. And there's a theoretical mechanism in which a carbon price could generate revenue that some of it could be directed towards loss and damage. But ultimately, there would need to be the political will to move forward on those. Now, the secondary aspect in terms of a capitalist kind of, is there economic opportunity in some of these actions? The answer is yes. When you see reports, for example, on adaptation, which is oftentimes an underfunded aspect of climate finance, there's really clear reports from the UN that planting mangrove trees off the coasts of certain areas is going to generate long-term economic value, both by sequestering carbon, but also acting as a buffer to extreme weather events. The problem is that the financial system as it's written today is not necessarily structured for that value to be attractive to the people with capital, which speaks to the income inequality and broad differences of who has capital in our markets. And one of the things that I heard a few people saying time and again, including high-level financiers, that I'll be excited to see what the evolving mechanisms are in different COPs. Is our current economic system was based on largely, a lot of it is Bretton Woods, which is an agreement that happened after World War II, in large part to help the rebuilding of Europe. And I heard multiple finance people saying, we need a Bretton Woods 2.0 that takes into account these aspects of climate finance, because a lot of it isn't being accounted for. A lot of it isn't flowing through the system. There's a lot of value at a systemic level that's being left on the table because, unfortunately, sometimes we're being incentivized to take shorter term, more narrow viewpoints that won't serve us in the long term.
I think, Jenny, if I could just add one piece, that I think within the negotiating dynamics, one of the challenges is that countries will often, and I'll speak to the US in particular, will often say, well, we can give so much, but really it's about leveraging private finance, and really it's about multilateral development banks, or really it's about these other pieces to really, in my view, and I think in our within our advocacy, we want to hold countries accountable, and there really needs to be the scale of what we're talking about in terms of loss and damage cannot be met by any individual, right? Like entity. It does take everybody, but there is a key role for governments to provide predictable, large scale financing for this. And so that's where we do our advocacy. And, in some of those, there's some interplay. I mean, Jake talked about a carbon tax. Certainly when we've had conversations about carbon tax in the US, oftentimes it talks about returning all that revenue to consumers and from the faith community. And this is both church and society, interfaith conversations, really to make sure that some of that revenue is available for international adaptation and international loss and damages. So that's part of the conversation. There's also a conversation about a windfall profits tax that came up in a meeting with the US negotiators. And if there's movement towards that, some of that money can be directed. So there's ways that the private sector could be impacted by government policies that generate revenue that the government would be able to direct towards this.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Friends, I imagine questions are coming to mind for you. Please put them in the chat. Do not put them in the chat. Please put them in the Q&A, because there's so much great chat happening. We can't follow it all. So if you have a question, please add it to the Q&A, and we'll be able to answer some of those questions a little bit later on in the webinar. Right now, though, I want to check in with each of you to see what your key learnings and takeaways are from this experience. Ilka, would you just kick us off with what you've learned and what you see, what your observations are?
Yeah, certainly. Well, it's been a packed week for us, as we have been following the negotiations on loss and damage. We continue, pushing for that language and being in solidarity with all the countries and people here from frontline communities that are directly impacted. On the other side of the conversation, we were also following closely on issues of gender and the importance of having inclusive processes if we want a just transition, right? A just transition is very important for us to not only as we're phasing out of fossil fuels, we should be pushing for, not only coal, right, but also gas and other fossil fuels completely, but then also making sure that as we're transitioning to renewable energies, that we're doing this in a just manner. And so one of the conversations that I had that was this spoke to me a lot was saying one of the things that had the most investment or return investment in terms of what we can do to mitigate the climate crisis. One of the best things that we could do to tackle the climate crisis was actually investing in women. And that would be women leadership, women's skills in the energy sector, just teaching women about, energy consumption and renewable energies and having them leadership. And that also speaks a lot to the COP process, because it's actually, when you see the heads of states, even the COP presidency, we see that we need more women, certainly. And so there has been a strong push for actually having co-chairs or co-presidents for COP being also women at COP. And I think that's an important conversation to be to be had if we really want some structural change to happen, right? Rethinking the financial process, but then also rethinking the leadership roles that we're having, in particularly in regards of gender perspectives. And then also some of the, it's just been inspiring to see also the lead from the frontline communities to take more place here at COP. I think that's a trend that we want to keep going. And so for us back at home, that means continuing that work as well, continue bringing that conversation into organizing spaces for United Women in Faith. It means continuing strengthening our leaders to speak with Congress and really push for, as appropriations are coming up, to really consider mitigation and adaptation into those conversations, because we need to have those conversations for Congress to approve appropriate money that we're needing for loss and damage mitigation, and coming from those resources as well. And then also for, I guess, we're trying to do our part also for institutions to kind of be thinking critically about our investments, and then also, again, just our engagement in generally more critically waiting for, especially on the US role, for us to just keep pushing Congress for more mitigation money. So that's what we're taking on with us. I don't know if, is that, John, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Ilka. So I think for me, one of the key learnings and just the takeaways is the recognition that climate solutions exist, the wisdom, the experience, the concrete implementable solutions exist. What doesn't exist is the political will. And so we see this political will among some countries. Let me just be clear. The US is one of them, right? So, I mean, for us, it's like, how do we sort of increase that ambition, that political will, so that folks can step out? The US came into this COP, and we heard this phrase over and over again among, from President Biden, from Special Envoy Kerry, from the US delegation, came with the wind at their back. Well, that might be the case because on mitigation, on emission reduction, because for the first time in many, many years, the US Congress and President signed into law legislation that would help reduce our emissions. That may have increased some US credibility on that part of the equation, but certainly not on the climate finance. Like, we have woefully underfunded. We have not met our pledges. And so we need to really ramp up our push on climate finance domestically. And folks have heard me say this over and over, right? Countries can't commit internationally what they can't deliver domestically. And so when we met with Speaker Pelosi and the US congressional delegation, so 15 members of Congress sitting in a room, challenged them on climate finance, they are really resistant. They don't think they have the votes for it. And so one of the ways that we can take action, those of us who live in the US, is to contact our members of Congress right now. I'm going to put an action alert in the chat for folks. This is specific to the appropriations conversations that are happening over the next few weeks, to make sure that we are including climate finance, significant climate finance, in our US appropriations. So that's like this, there's this continued sort of disconnect between the solutions here and the political will. And then the last thing that I'll say, just again, kind of hearing folks in all these different contexts and against the backdrop of COP happening in Egypt, which has just abysmal human rights record, that we have activists and advocates and frontline leaders from around the world who are willing to risk themselves. Like, what they are willing to risk for climate action is just so, it's awe-inspiring. And I think about in the US, oftentimes we are uncomfortable, or we don't want to risk our social standing, or we don't want to risk an uncomfortable conversation over the Thanksgiving dinner table. Yeah, I'll speak for myself and my family. That's, just to put that into perspective, that we need to get out of that, challenge that discomfort, and really work through it so that we can build a better consensus, stronger consensus, deeper consensus for climate action in the US. I'll pass it on to.
Yeah. What John and Ilka both said resonates with me. I think from taking on my hat as a finance, sustainable investment professional and thinking through some of these dynamics, I think it's a couple of takeaways that I would take from this is there was a quote on the Pakistani pavilion that we might have talked about at the last COP, or at the last week's webinar, which is what happens in Pakistan doesn't stay in Pakistan. And it was a statement around the intensity of the floods and how this is something that's kind of coming to us all. And so I think that hopefully what we can start to incentivize and think through within the financial system, certainly something we're trying to do at Westpath, is there's a moral calling to all of this that's very clear in terms of the injustice of a lot of what's been talked about. And there's also a real financial incentive to be thinking through some of these ways, because part of our framework at Westpath is that we need environmental health and social cohesion and long-term prosperity for all to have a functioning economy. And without those things, it's not as though what happens in Pakistan with that flooding stays in Pakistan. Unfortunately, it leads to instability. It leads to broader regional issues. It leads to economic hurt, as well as that distinct injustice that we were talking about. Jenny, I'm thinking of a conversation you and I had with an individual who's head of climate at a large insurance fund. We were asking her about some of the dynamics of extreme weather increasing and further effects on the portfolio. And speaking off the record, she shared with us, listen, we price our insurance at an annual level, and at some point that system breaks. And you no longer have access to insurance in coastal areas that are routinely flooding. So there's a phrase in economics that I really appreciate, which is, in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they should until they happen faster than you thought they could. And ultimately, part of what we're trying to do at Westpath is to get people on the front end of that wave as much as possible, given where we are in the climate crisis, to try to adapt, to try to facilitate an orderly transition, because we think that's in our best interests. And certainly hearing from everyone at the COP on all the ways that they're being impacted has only underlined the urgency of the need to be thinking less short-term, less narrow, more long-term, more systemic.
I really appreciate that and the reminder of that conversation, especially because the system is already breaking and broken. I mean, first of all, not everyone in the world has access to insurance at all. And in countries that do have insurance, many already can't afford it and haven't been able to afford it for a long time. And of course, that increases vulnerability. I think from a global ministries perspective, I'm thinking from a global ministries perspective and a person perspective. When you hear all of this, it's a lot to take in, and we're talking about these big systems and trying to figure out how they're going to interact with each other. And as an individual, it's hard to figure out how to find yourself in this conversation. So I would say, just as, I heard that part where we were talking about, corporations are waiting for governments to respond to them, and people with every different parties are waiting for other folks to do their thing so then they can do their thing. So I would just like to say, we can't wait as United Methodists to act and respond. We are going to continue to advocate, just as we have been, around pushing these negotiations the way that they need to go to ensure that those who are most vulnerable among us and those who have been most historically harmed are get what they need and are due. But we're working right now. We already aren't waiting, right? I mean, we're already engaged in disaster response and mitigation. We're already engaged in global health work that continues to strengthen healthcare systems right now that are being impacted by climate change. Many of you are in local churches that have been engaged in various types of response in your community to issues that people are facing due to environmental degradation and climate change. And you're going to have to continue to do that. And you're going to need to prepare yourselves to do even more than you're already doing. Jake, I'm sorry to pick on that phrase, orderly transition, but we are not having an orderly transition. We are in the midst of a great disorderly transition, where people are dying and suffering, and God's creation is suffering and being obliterated. Biodiversity is breaking down. There's a lot going on. And so I don't share that to be a point of despair or despair inducing, but rather to say that we have no more time to lose to look at where we sit in the world and our spheres of influence and the amount of agency and resources we have to help. We don't have time to wait and see. It's time now to start thinking about what more you could be doing than you are already doing. And I'm not talking about straws and tote bags. I'm talking about how do you transform the way your church does ministry? How do you look at your workplace and see how you could use your voice and the agency you have in your workplace to transform how they engage in the world? We are called as people of faith to be stewards of God's creation and to take risks, as John said, to push beyond our comfort zones. Everyone's going to have to push beyond their comfort zones because the discomfort is already happening. Some resources that we have to offer are available on the environmental sustainability page at Global Ministries, including the Global Ministries Earth Keepers program, where if you're someone who has an idea, but you need some help giving it some structure, this program offers training and support to structure an idea for making a difference. There are other resources as well. And of course, you've heard about the action alerts through Church and Society and UWF. So I just want to really encourage you to not leave this webinar thinking, wow, that was a lot. Hope they work it out. But rather to say, well, they've got a lot to deal with in that whole UN situation. How can our church be a voice and a resource where we sit in the world to take action now? With all that said, we do have time for some questions. And I'm just pulling up the Q&A here. Patricia, I really appreciate this question. Many editorials in the US are criticizing the costs of the COP and the carbon footprint of flying everybody there and back. And there are also concerns about corporate representatives at the COP. She wonders our thoughts and also notes it does seem like it could be useful to have everyone together in the room. Do any of you have some thoughts on that? Is it right to bring everybody together for this? Is it worth it? Is it worth the impact?
I'll start. I think it's an important question and one that we need to keep in front of us consistently. I'll say that for the years during the pandemic when the COP didn't meet and then the UN transitioned some of its work online only, it's very difficult both to have conversations that bridge all the time zones that happen simultaneously, and so that all countries can be represented, to have equal access to internet among all countries, and then for civil society to be present. And so I think, as much as there is a carbon cost for these gatherings and a monetary cost, it is a unique venue, as we named before, that helps flatten some of the global structures, provides voice and agency for all climate vulnerable communities, and allows civil society to really infuse the urgency into these negotiations. And so, having witnessed what happens when it doesn't gather, which is not a lot, I think this is our best hope to keep ramping up ambition to meet the urgency of the crisis.
It kind of reminds me of General Conference, that we struggle to bring together a General Conference because there wouldn't be equity among the participants if we tried to hold it online due to access issues. Appreciate that. Yeah, I see there's some hands raised, and I'm wondering if you could, those of you who have your hands raised, I can't actually see who you are well, and I'm wondering if you could put your questions in the Q&A. At the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tab. If you could share your questions there, then we'll be able to access them easily. David, I'm so glad you're here to ask these questions. David Wildman, another staff person of Global Ministries, shares that a new report documents that the world militaries would be the fourth largest consumer of fossil fuels and cause of emissions. The US military is the single largest consumer of fossil fuels. How is the COP addressing the link between military spending and climate injustice? Ilka, have you crossed paths with this? And if not, Jake, I wonder, do you recall the conversation that happened in that meeting with the US folks? Ilka, if you've got something on that first, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I saw some side events talking about it, but I think it's definitely something that has been missing from the conversation, even in terms of the IPCC report. Sometimes those data are not very precise as to whether they include some of that military spending into fossil fuels. And so I think it's definitely much needed. Also, when we're talking about where are we going to get the money from, because our military spending has continued to increase, yet our climate justice funds continue to be in deep need for funding. And so it's definitely a conversation that we're hoping to have and hoping that communities at home are also pushing for, to start a conversation on that. But I don't know if you guys had more on it, Jake, the first week.
Yeah, so taking part in a conversation with the U.S. negotiators, there was a woman who was actually a fellow faith-based representative who asked a question directly on this, David, to the negotiation. John or Jenny, welcome you helping to round out my memory on this, but effectively she was saying that her feeling was that her interpretation was that the U.S. emissions were not being included in targets and were thus not being managed in terms of the nationally determined contributions. The negotiation seemed like the negotiators were seeking some clarification. They felt that there was a certain exclusion, although it wasn't necessary to set targets. But that was actually one of the questions that they were most receptive to kind of follow on engagement on and continued conversation. So we did actually see an intervention directly on that topic, and it is getting, I think, raised a little bit more consistently in dialogues.
Awesome. And David, you've got another question here about oil producing countries being some of the most repressive regimes regarding human rights. How are the interactions between human rights and climate justice being addressed? John, do you have something here?
I wish I had more. I'll note that the Paris Agreement was the first climate agreement that did include human rights. It was unfortunately just in the preamble, but there was an explicit reference. I mean, I think this kind of goes to show just how difficult it is to build consensus around human rights globally. Again, it's a consensus process, so everyone has to agree to it. So the only thing they could agree to was naming it within the preamble to the Paris Agreement. And so there is this sort of consistent track of advocacy that happens within the COP to try and include human rights language throughout, as we're talking about operationalizing commitments around emissions reductions and on adaptation plans. I'll say that it was a particularly difficult COP this year because of it being located in Egypt, and there was a much higher elevation of human rights abuses within the COP venue. And at the same time, we were unable to hold a public witness outside of the COP venue because of the Egyptian government. And so it was one of those where I think that it was actually elevated more for folks that had the credentials to be walking around. And there were a number of civil society demonstrations elevating human rights. So those are kind of the two pieces, but sadly not enough agreement on the importance of human rights within the actual text.
If I could just add a quick point on that, Jenny, and Ilka, saw you come up and would love to hear what you have to say too. Mine's just kind of a brief anecdote in that with what John was sharing about Egypt, I had a chance to talk to a woman who's a prominent climate and racial justice advocate in the US. And this being my first COP and it being kind of shrouded in this controversy, I asked her what her decision-making process was in terms of attending the COP, given the human rights controversy around it. And one of the things that she said that was just, indicative of the gray or complexities of some of these conversations is that when she talked to a group of Pan-African climate justice advocates that she works closely with, they told her, we think it's really important that people come. It's the first African COP, and it's important that it not be boycotted. Because that, ultimately, while we recognize that there's problematic aspects of Egypt, that feels like it's worse than coming and kind of expressing some discontent in that. I then asked her, she made a comment about, and they didn't feel like they wouldn't be able to relocate it within Africa. And I kind of asked, was there not another venue? Kind of what was the circumstance? I'd expect somewhere else could host. And that was a much more just like reminder that people are people and humans are humans and institutions are fallible, where she said, they just worried if they tried to relocate it, the UN would automatically just move it to Bonn or to somewhere in Europe because it'd get too complicated and that would be their default. And that they would lose this being the first African COP, which I think is ultimately just a reminder that ultimately, these are people making decisions. These are, fallible humans such as ourselves, sometimes running these processes in a very complex and multifaceted intersectional circumstance.
Ilka, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I think just on the question of oil and countries and human rights violations, I think it just a thought that also it makes us consider who our partners are in terms of who we trade with, right? And one of the conversations and a point that was raised by Department of State Secretary Granholm was that fossil fuels actually make us dependent to other countries. Solar and wind are actually much more isolated, and we can have much greater control of those domestically, right? And so some people have been in different conversations just really advocating for the idea of renewable energies, calling them freedom energy in a way, which I think can be a very interesting language when we're tracking in this nonpartisan language that we're trying to adopt, because it's a very interesting conversation and it makes a great point. It's a matter of or national security to really have energy efficiency and sustainability at home, right? And being able to provide for our own people. And so I think it's a case for those for renewable energies, at least when we're talking about, if we don't want to be partnering with countries that have historical human rights violation, I think it can be a great strategy to be thinking of how can we incentivize more renewable energy at home and be more energy independent.
Yeah, absolutely. Jake and I got to have a small group conversation with Chandala Baker of the U.S. Department of Energy, and the topic was on energy democracy and really looking at how to develop energy systems that are democratic, that are engaged with by the people. What are models that we need to be looking at for community solar? What are the challenges that we face in making decision making and control over energy resources? What challenges do we have in relationship to utilities and how they're currently run? So it was interesting to see our own U.S. Department of Energy thinking about these issues from the sense of how do we have more freedom and agency within our own energy consumption. Regarding the questions and conversation around making a decision to go somewhere with a repressive regime and go somewhere with where there's a high carbon cost to attending, these are really important questions. And again, these are questions that we as United Methodists can be engaging as we are thinking about how we plan events that we lead and make decisions about events that we attend. I just want to mention United Methodist Women of Faith has a fantastic resource around meeting planning and how to think through these types of decisions. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Ilka, but if you have a link that you could share, we use it at Global Ministries in the Global Ministries Earthkeepers program. We rely on the UWF resource to think through how we're making decisions about venues, food, vendors, who we're purchasing goods and services from. And it's something where the more that people generally are practicing thinking about these issues, the more the thoughtfulness is integrated into how we plan events and how we make decisions about what events we're going to attend. There is one more question, a couple more questions in here. One is about population growth and as a comment, advocating for promoting women's rights, not only around population, but also the importance of training and leadership and participation in society that's so important to addressing climate change. So thank you, Barry, for that. Martha Lyle, it's nice to have you here. You live in a row crop agriculture area. I think that's what I'm reading. Are there resources helpful, specifically speaking to agriculture folks, elected officials in these areas, and regarding the Farm Bill and climate? John, you're nodding. Can you respond to this?
I'm nodding because it's a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer. So yes, the Farm Bill will be something we talk more about next year. It's not going to happen in the lame duck. The conversation between now and the next 118th Congress. They did release this. It's a long process to develop the Farm Bill. There was a draft of the energy title of the Farm Bill. So I think when folks think about ag most times, and the largest titles deal with nutrition and crop subsidies, but there is a pretty robust conservation title and energy title. And so that was just drafted, and we'll be engaging that next year. And hopefully, Martha Lyle and others, we can connect with you about how to equip you to have those conversations.
Fantastic. Wow, what a rich conversation. I want to just note that in the chat, a lot of folks have shared links to a variety of resources. So I hope you'll take a moment to look through, and you can just kind of click on each one, and then they'll be open in your web browser, and you can follow up with those that you wish to pursue further. As we close, Jake, do you want to share some closing thoughts to wrap up our time together?
Yeah. After the conversation at the webinar on week 1, Jenny and John and I had a discussion on one of the questions that came, which was kind of relating to what should individual church members be doing, or what should the people in the pews, those of you that are active members of the United Methodist community, be doing in relation to these large, systemic, intersectional, often very overwhelming questions and problems that we're addressing. And one of the pieces that I just really wanted to advocate as a supporter of each of my compatriots on the line is to continue to get further involved in the various activities of different agencies, to continue to support and be collaborative, and to do the work, and to tap on the resources that are available to you at that immediate individual level. So Jenny has referenced Earthkeepers a few different times, and I think Jonathan has put a link to that in the chat. Speaking as an Earthkeepers alumni, a wonderful program that can help not only ground you in a project with some clarity, but also really put you in community with others, which I think is so important and necessary, because part of a quote that I love is a Buddhist preacher who's talking about working with climate activists on a podcast. And towards the tail end, one of the things that the interviewer asks him is, what more do you wish activists had? And he says, I wish more activists were coming from a place of love. He says, I understand the anger, I understand the hurt that people are feeling around issues like climate. But ultimately, from his religion, and I think often from many aspects of our religion, it's that love, it's that generative love that has the most positive impact. So you'll have community with Jenny in the Earthkeepers training. With Ilka, you'll have a strong sense of clarity and activism and justice that's not only grounded in a US context, but is informed by these global conversations. With John at Church and Society, there's work being done that's really thoughtful about how to change the system and move it forward. And by you all really taking those next steps that you see available, that energize you, that are part of what brought you to listen to us for an hour in this conversation, and putting that into action at the ground level, you are helping to generate that political will and systemic change that we're talking about. So we just really encourage you and hopefully energize you all to make that phone call, to sign up for that list, to send that email, to do whatever that next step is, because that's the work that we're trying to do on your behalf, energized by you, and that is always made better by your support and participation.
Thanks, Jake. Thank you, Jake. It's a powerful call to action. I am grateful to each one of you for joining us for this conversation, and pray that this conversation will continue as you bring it to your churches. Please feel free to use those webinar recordings. Use these for an adult Sunday school, couple weeks. You can share all or part of these webinars and have dialogue about these issues within your local churches. I pray that you will find a way to engage and new ways to use your influence and share God's love in the world. Thanks for being with us. Goodbye.